Hello, everyone. Greetings and salutations. This is Volts for June 3rd, 2026. Are plug-in DERs going to spark a grid revolution? I'm your host, David Roberts. As Volts listeners have heard many times now, large utility-scale renewable energy and battery projects are being slowed to a crawl by a tangle of red tape, from glacial interconnection queues to permitting hassles to environmental review and on and on. Smaller scale, customer-side renewable energy and battery projects, collectively known as distributed energy resources or DERs, move somewhat more quickly, but unfortunately not by much. They too have interconnection and permitting hassles, alongside the various and sundry soft costs that have been discussed on this podcast so many times. But there is a new class of DERs emerging that are even smaller and that you can simply plug into a normal wall outlet without getting any kind of permit, interconnection, or regulatory approval. This includes so-called plug-in solar, which we covered on a previous Volts pod, but also small-scale batteries. Plug-in DERs might seem, at first blush, like a kind of cute novelty item. Fun, but irrelevant to the larger energy picture. But my guest today, James McGinniss, CEO of David Energy and co-founder of the DER Task Force community and podcast, believes that take is wrong, dramatically, fatefully wrong. He believes that plug-in DERs are eventually going to scale to a cumulative size larger than bigger DERs, and that they are going to put a rocket boost under the small d democratic revolution in energy that DERs have long promised. McGinniss has been selling plug-in batteries to small businesses in New York City, who are using them not for any high-minded green reasons, not even for resilience like the more expensive home batteries, but simply to reduce their electricity rates. And business is booming. We are going to talk all about the merits of plug-in DERs, the market for them, and why he thinks they are going to spark a grid revolution. No further ado, James McGinniss, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
I listened to your podcast. I've heard a lot of your talks, and you are deep in DER world, DERs, as you affectionately refer to them.
DERs, that's right. Yes.
DER world, DER pilled, etc. For those in the audience, maybe who are not fully DER pilled and who are not totally familiar with distributed energy resources, let's just do some definitions. So as I understand it, there's DERs, and then within that, there's a smaller class of what we call permissionless DERs. And then within that, there's a smaller class of plug-in DERs, which is what we're talking about today. So let's start just by defining our terms. So start just by defining what are DERs. This is like, I think, a deceptively complicated question. What is your personal definition of DERs?
I'm going to attempt to give you a definition. I also think as time has gone on, I've continued to get surprised about what a DER is. So I reserve the right to change my mind later. And it's a bit of like, you know it when you see it kind of, and
yes.
Most famously, Kieran actually from Arcadia told me an induction stove was a DER, and I laughed him out of the room. And then I learned about Impulse Labs and copper and battery embedded devices, which kicked off this whole permissionless conversation. And so I ended up eating my words that was in fact a DER. But I would just say that the property or the principle that is true across DERs or most exciting is that you're essentially citing supply or capacity next to demand. That capacity could even be the demand itself. Like you could have a programmable thermostat or electric vehicles that you shift load with. But at the end of the day, it's supply or capacity located where the customer is consuming power. And that property of locating supply next to demand is what I think makes DERs so powerful.
So in your mind, whether it is behind the meter or in front of the meter, there are DERs in both cases. You're not a behind the meter guy.
No, I mean, I think if you look at, a lot of what some of the current frameworks have started to do, like a VDER or avoided costs or non-wiles alternatives, placing solar and storage on distribution feeders, like community solar, it could be a 5 megawatt system. That's a DER because it's helping reduce transmission and distribution costs, or could potentially if you deploy them in the right way. And then on the other side of things, I think you can have gigawatt scale DERs. So you have large data center sited solar storage and gas primarily. Duncan on the DR task force as well wrote that awesome off-grid white paper, which isn't actually only about being off-grid. It could be, you can have fully off-grid, you can have grid connected systems, you can have them front of the meters located next to a data center, all that stuff. If you're augmenting how you're actually distributing power on the grid, those are DERs in our mind. So we look at DERs as everything from one of these small 400 watt plug-in solar systems that we may talk about all the way up to a gigawatt scale system behind the meter at a data center.
Interesting. So it's mainly about locations, which makes sense since the word distributed.
Co-location. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
That's the sort of property that excited me, a decade ago. I would say though that I love all DERs. I get more and more bullish on distributed solar and storage every year and think that the lion's share of what we think of as distributed capacity and supply will be solar and storage.
Amen, brother. That is the thesis of this podcast. So then within DERs, there's this class of permissionless DERs, which is distributed energy resources that you can just install without getting permission from any sort of regulatory body. What is that? What is included in that class? What all falls in there?
So it's funny. I actually think Duncan coined permissionless on one of our podcasts a few years ago. And at the time, we were thinking about actually two applications in particular. One was Impulse Labs battery embedded stove, where that is a plug-in DER. Right. And then Electric Era's DC fast chargers that have batteries that keep you from needing to upsize an interconnection to site a DC fast charger that's Quincy at Electric Era. And we said, oh, cool, you can deploy more DC fast chargers without interconnection upgrades or permission to interconnect. You may need a interconnection there. I'm not actually entirely sure, but at the time, in the early days of this, we thought anything that sort of skirted the need for complex, expensive, and permissioned utility upgrades were permissionless.
Right. And also along on the lines of the Impulse stove, what Jigar Shah is very excited about is Carrier is going to start embedding batteries in air conditioning units.
That's right.
And they sell cajillions of those a year.
Yeah.
And you do not need a permit to plug your AC in.
That's right.
And also, I think you could add some of this off-grid, like for data centers, but not just for data centers, like a microgrid or whatever. You can put more and more batteries on your microgrid. And as long as your interconnection point stays stable, you don't need additional permission to do that.
That's right. I was going to joke that I even think XAI, their data center was maybe, as I've read about it since, maybe like too permissionless. But
yeah, you can also just do it even if you're supposed to get permission. You can just do it illegally.
Right, yes.
I suppose that's a subcategory.
I appreciate the impulse to just build something more than waiting like 6 years for an interconnection, as long as it's being done safely and makes sense ultimately.
I like the wild and woolly approach. It would just be nice if it were being done in service of renewables and batteries instead of a bunch of
yes, I definitely agree with that.
Jet engines on tractor trailer beds.
Yes.
Okay, so that's permissionless, and so then within permissionless, there's plug-in, which is what we're talking about today. So plug-in solar, we covered that pretty extensively on the pod the other day. It's just these small scale, usually like single panel or two. And then there's also plug-in batteries, which is what you are mainly doing. And so I guess what counts as a plug-in battery, like if you're going to put a Tesla Powerwall in, you got to get permission for that. That's a scale of battery that triggers some regulatory oversight. So how small of a battery do you have to get before you are avoiding these regulations when you can just do it? Like, what size of battery can you just plug in at will?
Well, it's interesting because during your intro, I wanted to make an objection actually to calling plugins small. I would have said the same months ago, but I don't think plugin is small necessarily. I'll expand on that in a moment. Plugin to me is just you plug it directly into 120 or 240 volt outlet, or any type of outlet, but it's using existing grid infrastructure and interconnection points we have, which is most commonly the 120 volt outlet.
Right. And the insight here, which I guess is controversial, but is sort of the core insight, all this agita about finding usable interconnection points. And the point here with plugin stuff is just like, we're actually surrounded by already permitted interconnection points. They are called outlets.
That's right. And honestly, through this plugin journey over the last year, I've had multiple points during it that have blown my mind or like re-derpilled me to an extent, actually like gotten me even more bullish on this stuff somehow. And the first one was just that idea that outlets are pre-existing bidirectional interconnection points. Bidirectional is the key here. You can push power back into a circuit, and that is totally allowed. It's like, and so that's an interconnection point to the grid.
It's allowed some places. We're going to get to that in a minute. But before we get too far in, let's back up a little bit and just tell us what David Energy is. Tell us what your company does. Tell us what you've been doing since 2020 and what is different that you're doing since January of this year, right? January of this, you sort of launched this plugin part of things pretty recently, but like just give us a smidge of background on what David Energy does.
Yeah, so maybe I'll give you the sort of overarching what the mission has been from day one, which is to run the grid 24/7 on clean energy. By that, we mean we are a licensed electricity provider. We can choose our own sources of supply. Our goal is to prove that it's possible to run our book 100% on clean energy in real time, physically time aligning supply and demand, not like offsets or anything like that. The reason for that is we think clean electrons are the cheapest electrons by far. And if we can do that, we're going to be the cheapest commodity supplier. And if you're the cheapest commodity supplier, you can grow incredibly fast and build a big business.
So you're a retail energy provider. In other words, like a home or a business in a place that has retail competition, which is not everywhere, but in a place that has retail competition and people can choose their energy suppliers, you are an energy supplier. And your distinction is you're the clean one and the cheap one, or that's the idea.
Yeah,
right?
And something confounded me early on in the journey, which is like solar and storage were becoming the cheapest electrons, and that if you go and buy like a quote green product, which is basically a rec product, it was a premium product. And we're like, why is this the cheapest source of power? And actually, if you want to buy it from a supplier, it's more expensive than the alternative. And so, yeah, we think clean is cheap if you're not doing offsets, if you're actually doing it on like the real-time demand supply matching basis day in and day out, which this is where, the problem that's fascinated me since 2015 probably is everyone talking about intermittency and how do you manage lots of solar and storage or wind on grids? How do you actually run grids with very high penetrations of these? And that problem has been what we want to solve through just doing it as a licensed supplier.
Like, are all your offerings 100% clean? All your customers are getting 100% clean power?
Today, no, and that's the goal. And so we could talk about what we're doing now. So what I would say is over the last few years, we launched a software product to our customer base, which is small businesses, which we've viewed as very underserved in this market. So think multi-locations, restaurants, gyms, cafes, laundromats, stuff like that, whereby they get access to great features like thermostat management and bill auditing and community solar. And that product is free to them if they're buying their energy through us. The reason we did this is as early as we started, there was not a lot of solar and storage to go out and get. The path to powering our entire book on clean supply was daunting, I'd say.
Right, because in some sense, you're buying wholesale power and selling it to customers. So in some, you're dependent on who's producing the wholesale power, right, for the most part.
That's right. And we get to actually choose who we go and buy that power from. And so what's changed recently is we see a much stronger path in the near term to actually get to very meaningful penetrations of clean energy supply within our own book over even the next year because of things like our ability to deploy plug-in batteries and also the proliferation of solar and community solar and things like that. And so you can just think of it as up until last year, all of our supply was not clean. This year, we're starting to get some clean. And every year that goes on, our percentage is going to increase towards 100. That's our goal. And actually, the more solar and storage we get under management, the cheaper our power is going to be and the more we're going to be able to grow. So the way that expresses itself in, you mentioned this, what we're doing today is we go to customers and we say, because there's so much value in these plug-in batteries, if you let us install plug-in batteries and take over your energy supply, we guarantee that we will beat the utility month over month. You will pay less to, in this case, Con Edison, than you would have without David Energy, where we're taking over the supply side of that bill.
And they're not paying for the batteries. The batteries are effectively free for the customer.
Yes. So there's no CapEx for them. There's actually no even long-term lockup, which is one of those other sort of aha moments, remarkable properties for us, which is you can unplug the battery and move it very easily, meaning you don't need to get the customer to agree to like a 20-year mortgage-like lease on their home or the land they own or something like that. There's not even a long-term lockup for this. So it's just, if we come in and install these plug-in batteries, you're going to save money every month relative to what you would have paid the utility.
I got a bunch of questions about that, a bunch of questions about the economics and various other things. But let's just start with the batteries that you're selling today. How big are they and what do they look like?
Yeah, we'll work backward to my small objection at some point. But
we'll get there.
The batteries we are deploying right now, you could classify as small. They're about, just under 2 kilowatt hours. You can configure them basically as like a 2-hour battery. We can do multiple of those in sequence. And so our standard install will put a few of those in series and, sum up to something closer to a Powerwall.
I was looking at the pictures. They look basically like a toaster, like the size of a big toaster.
That's right.
We're heading toward big here, but let's not diss on small, which means that you can tuck them anywhere in a business. You can put them in a basement. You can put them on the bottom shelf. You can tuck them up above the cabinet. So like almost any business will have room for a couple of these, right?
Yeah, the first objection we always hear from like a New York City restaurateur is like, there's no way I'm going to have space for that. And we actually have like a 98% success rate on installs. And you can always find space, which is great. That's something that's nice about the current form factor.
It's interesting in particular that you're doing this in New York City, because New York City is sort of legendarily kind of like highly regulated. Like you can't even install a Tesla Powerwall in New York City, can you? Because of the fire risk. So like there are regulations on energy storage systems in New York City. Right now, it seems like your batteries are too small to kind of trigger those regulations, but I was looking into this and it looks like New York City has issued some new rules that lower the threshold down to like 1 kilowatt hour, and yours are bigger than that. So I'm sort of curious, like how are you sneaking past regulations here in New York City?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, one thing that's important to recognize is that it's not that you can't install, it's that there is so much red tape often and even getting something approved that a lot of folks have chosen not to do that and just take their efforts elsewhere. And there's a few different companies out there, from Every Electric or Copper Stoves that are doing batteries in this way. And there's a few aspects to it. One is that UL 9540 and 9540A are sort of historically were not certifications that these consumer level batteries were going after. And that is sort of the gold standard that FDNY and other jurisdictions take as what is necessary in order to be able to get a COA and do these installations. I think the other thing that, and you had a recent podcast with Cora from Brightsaver, I think that's what you were mentioning before, is that the way that rules are being written in many parts of the country, it's clear that a lot of these use cases are not even being contemplated. And that there's a certain amount of gray area in like what can and cannot be done.
Right, right. That's what I was kind of trying to get at. And this is sort of like a, let's do it. And if we have to, ask forgiveness later rather than ask permission up front, there's a little bit of like, let's just put a bunch of these out there and get them working rather than waiting for this kind of regulations to resolve themselves completely.
We don't think the regulations here or in a lot of cases are clear for this type of application in particular. And on top of that, that the gold standard that these jurisdictions care about are UL 9540 and 9540A, which the products we're using do have. And what we focus on above all else is that what we're doing is compliant with NEC, UL certified products. It's completely safe the way that we're doing it. And we think as those gray areas are worked through, that the intent behind the rules are driving towards that over time.
Okay. And so these batteries that you're putting in small businesses, it doesn't seem like they're kind of big enough to like, if the power went out, you could run your business on them. That's not really the pitch here. The pitch is mainly reducing peak demand charges, right? So maybe just explain briefly, like, what is the peak demand charge and why is it helpful to shave a restaurant's peak in order to avoid it?
Right. So there's certainly some customers that we get into that level of detail. I think primarily customers don't get into that level of detail. The pitch is we are going to save you money against Con Ed, and that's enough.
Sure.
But
the pitch to me, a podcaster. Right.
Yes, correct. But we do get into the demand and supply side of the bill, where on the demand side or the delivery side, they're still being billed by Con Edison. They're assessed a charge by their 15-minute interval peak every month. So the single 15-minute interval where they have their highest instantaneous draw from the grid. So we predict those peaks and we discharge the batteries during those. And that allows us to say, hey, if you didn't have us, your peak demand would have been 12 kilowatts instead of 10 kilowatts or something like that. The other side of it is a little more complicated. Because we're the energy supplier, there is responding to real-time prices. There is responding to peak capacity tag events, which is a whole other can of worms that we can get into, but sets how much they have to pay into the capacity market. There's demand response programs at the utility level and at the ISO level. And the customer does not need to think about any of that. We take care of all that complexity on the back end and just say, hey, this is the supply rate you would have paid Con Edison, and it's lower because of some aggregate pool of money that we've generated with the battery and are giving them a discount on the supply rate to do that.
In a sense, lots of batteries are doing this, and I think this is a familiar concept to listeners. It's just arbitrage, right? Like you charge the battery when power's cheap and you discharge the battery when power's expensive. It's just you're doing that arbitrage on a kind of a micro scale within the premises, within the business. It's sort of like a micro arbitrage, I guess. But the principle is basically the same. Like you're shaving peaks, you're responding to demand charges, you're enrolling in demand response programs. It's all the same thing kind of bigger batteries do, just kind of on a micro scale within the premises of a customer business. Is that fair?
Yeah. And by micro, I just take it to mean, I'm going to continue. I'm going to continue talking about small and micro. I take it to mean that we're doing it through the demand. So an important note here is we are not exporting through these batteries at all.
Yes, right. We're going to get to that for sure.
You could, and that's a lot of the great work that BrightSaver is doing. And I think it's particularly relevant for the smaller consumer applications in which they're talking about.
But you're not currently
Correct.
exporting any power into the grid. All this arbitrage is sort of within the premises itself, just moving power around within the customer side.
That's right. Because we're the supplier, we pay that customer's energy obligation on their behalf. And if we lower that energy obligation during high prices, we can generate savings by doing that, which you can only really do if you are the energy retailer.
Right. Let me ask this, like there is some CapEx involved. You're buying these batteries. So I'm just curious, like how long does a customer relationship need to last for you to pay off that CapEx of buying the battery yourself and eating the cost of the battery yourself?
We think about it as sort of the non-CapEx expenses, actually, like traditional CAC basically, or even there are some minor setup costs for the installations that we're doing, but they're only like 10% of system costs instead of 50+%, which is what you typically see. And that doesn't necessarily have to be true. So we actually do send a licensed electrician on site and create our own dedicated outlets for the batteries, which is sort of the gold standard of doing this very safely. Again, which is the main focus that we have in doing this.
Right. So that's some cost, and the batteries themselves are some cost. And then there are savings over time. I guess I'm just asking, like, is this kind of a loss leader in order to acquire customers? Or do those costs get paid back to you? And if so, like, how long does that take?
Without ITC or anything, or providing any savings to the customers, just the raw value of the battery is something like 3 years. Mm-hmm. And as we optimize that, we think that drops even more. And I'll get into that in a moment. But so the costs that we want to recover are sort of the cost of acquiring that customer and the minor cost of installation, which may be a much shorter amount of time, like a year. And if that customer were to churn, we can go pick that battery up and move it to the next location.
So it's your battery.
That's right. And we could do that in a day. Like I pick it up. Right. You think of the density in metropolitan areas.
Unplug it.
I unplug it. I pick it up at one restaurant and then I move it to our next installation, of which we have a big queue of. And then you start, running the meter on that side of things. So that the cost that we focus on recovering, and there's even like contractual things you can do around this, is like the initial setup cost and the cost of customer acquisition. We only need a customer for a couple years for that to make sense, which would be like the life of like a traditional software or SaaS customer, right? And then because we're able to move the battery, we have the full useful life is reported as 15 years, but it could even be even longer to recover the costs of pay off the CapEx of that battery. It's just an asset that we own that we can place where we want.
One of the really cool, I think maybe even like one of the coolest aspects of all this is that you can strike these deals with tenants rather than landlords, basically. Like you don't have to get the owner of the building involved in this. It is a tenant relationship, which is cool because, as you say, that's an underserved, this is a problem in multifamily housing too, which we'll touch on in a minute. But I just wonder, like, what if landlords do butt in? Like, do they ever object to having batteries on site? People are very paranoid about batteries for a lot of different reasons. Or like, I was thinking, like, if there's a fire in the business, even if the batteries aren't involved, is insurance going to come in and see a battery and freak out? Like, the tenant can do this, but are there risks from like landlords and insurance companies and that kind of thing?
Yeah. And I think this even goes back to your question around regulations, is that like, we don't think as much about the regulatory framework that BrightSaver does because we don't export and are not currently. So when I said you're allowed to do this currently under code, I'm thinking like NEC, UL, not requiring an interconnection agreement, things like that, because you're not exporting, right? And so certainly, yes, batteries, the most likely scenario is they could become a scapegoat for other problems that happen on site, which we expect to happen over time. Any new technology is going to encounter that.
And New York City has had some, negative experiences with battery fires. So there's the paranoia is not completely unfounded.
But if you're going to buy a non-UL certified product from China and then plug like 20 different e-bikes into it with like 40 surge protectors, like, yeah, that can probably be an issue. Like, that's what we mean about this application not being contemplated really and how safe it truly is. Like, we think deploying in the way we are is incredibly safe. It's possible that a local jurisdiction or a landlord says, hey, not in my building or not in, this region or something. But when you look at the broad scope of where this stuff is headed over time, I think of those as like minor speed bumps because...
Yeah, have you run into that yet? Has anyone...
We have not, no. All that said, I do want to emphasize your point that this being accessible to tenants is one of those other aha moments, like a remarkable property of plug-in technologies. It also gets into the tenure thing I mentioned. Like, you can equipment finance this stuff. You don't need a 20-year asset-backed securitized loan with a credit-worthy off-taker. You just need, you can actually look more at, hey, what is this unit? Can it be redeployable? What is the resale value of this or something to that effect? where that property, on top of not needing a permit, on top of not needing landlord approval, is what removes all the friction from deploying these.
Yeah, and vastly expands the customer pool. Another thing, I was trying to think about risks to sort of the unit economics here. Another thing is, like, as you say, this is sort of not customer facing. All you're really telling the customer is you'll save money. But this is sort of dependent on arbitrage behind the scenes. And I wonder, like, if Con Ed changes its tariff structure or maybe like reduces peak demand charges, is that going to hurt you? Like, how dependent are your economics on the existing tariff structure?
Well, not on the supply side, because, that would be a much more substantial change, like deregulation at the state level, at the PSC level. Because what deregulation means is we're allowed to enroll that meter. It's our meter with the New York ISO, and the interval data financially settles to the ISO data. And so we have that financial obligation. So there's nothing on the supply side that you could change the tariff or something. Con Ed can offer their own tariff for their own supply products in our minds. They would simply compete with the products that we're able to offer. They typically don't really spend much time on it because they're not allowed to make money on it. They can only make money on deploying infrastructure, right? And so, yes, we do benefit from peak demand charges. I suppose it's conceivable that could always change. It's so far flung that it's not really a risk that we think about. You can say, like, there are in residential customer classes, for example, they'll have like volumetric delivery charges, not peak demand delivery charges. And so that can impact your ability to recover. It also, if you have solar, though, can enhance it because it means if you're pushing volume in, you're avoiding those charges. So like all of this is there's more elegant designs around tariffs and prices than others, but we think the base level framework in all the major ISOs like PJM, New England, New York, ERCOT, where we're focused over time, give us the framework to deploy and have really solid unit economics.
So you think you'll be able to beat Con Ed for the indefinite future?
Yes, and we should beat it more and more over time. Because as we get closer to 100% clean, right? So one thing we didn't talk about at the unit economics is we're actually starting now to deploy our own solar, or aiming to this year.
The plug-in variety.
Well, that's something that we're starting to explore, but we would also do the sort of traditional front of the meter stuff as well as our own supply source. So as we get more and more of that, we beat the utility by more and more, and that can lead to more savings for customers or more margin for us.
Right. Another question about the cleanliness of all this. You're just kind of shifting around, and so the cleanliness of it, to some extent, depends on what's on the grid, what's available on the wholesale level. And like, as I understand it, like most of the nighttime power in New York is gas. So, is this necessarily a cleaner? I mean, it's cheaper, right, for the reasons we've discussed, but is it necessarily cleaner? In some sense, you're dependent on what's on the grid, are you not? I mean, less so over time as you install more of your own, say, community solar or whatever, but currently.
Right. So I would say two things. One is the point you just hit, which is deploying storage gives us an ability to manage solar in our book, like manage the exposure that the intermittency brings.
Right.
So even if the solar is not on site, we're effectively storing our own solar in our on-site batteries from like at the end of the day, ISOs are just like big financial markets. You have pluses and minuses. You have sources and sinks, exporting power or pulling power, producing or consuming. And so that's one big piece of it, is this storage will allow us to deploy solar finally. The other part of it is that we use some very dirty peak sources in New York. We use fuel oil, we use nasty stuff when things get really bad. And so if we're discharging during these peak times, yes, we're avoiding some of the most dirty and expensive resources out there.
Got it. So almost always the customer will be getting cheaper power than they would on Con Ed's plan, but also cleaner power.
That's right. And we don't talk a ton about the clean now because how clean it's getting is going to strengthen over time.
Right. I mean, this is just a good place to pause and emphasize this because I'm not sure we emphasized it enough up front. You're just going to a customer and saying, hey, I'll give you cheaper power. from the day you sign up, you'll get cheaper power. That is that is a pitch that is sufficient unto itself and requires no additional motivations. You don't have to be green. You don't have to care about anything else, basically. Like, this is why this is intriguing to me, is because for a long time, trying to sell DERs, you need people who care about cleanness. You need people maybe to care about resilience. You need these sort of other motivations to overcome the financial premium. But here, it's just a pure cost play, right? Cheaper power, period, full stop.
Yes, and you don't even have to mention that it's going to get even cheaper the cleaner you get, which is what we're obviously psyched about. But yeah, I would love to emphasize that resilience and sustainability have been marketed as premium products. And that's been where DERs have had the most success. Of course, there are savings pitches out there, but it's unclear in a lot of cases whether those customers actually did save money, because it's like a 20-year agreement they're signing to, and there's some forward projection of power, and you have to believe in, inflation escalators and all this stuff, right? But we just say, in a single month, if we do not save you money, you can leave and we will come pick up these batteries. So I think that's something that's very new as well.
So let's now talk about feeding back into the grid. So right now, you're not feeding power into the grid through these outlets because, although you say it is possible, it is in fact, I think, illegal to do so most places. Like in the plug-in solar pod, we discussed how Utah has sort of pioneered allowing a little bit of feedback into the grid. I guess I wonder, how much of a restriction is it on you on the size and number of batteries that you can install on one of these premises that you can't currently legally feed back into the grid? And were you allowed to feed back into the grid, how much would that improve the systems that you're able to install? How much of a restriction is it that you can't currently?
Yeah, so we think more about the AHJ, like DOB or FDNY or those types of regulations more so than the exporting one. The reality is that our customer peak demands are quite large as commercial. They range from 10 kW if you're a small cafe up to, north of 100 kilowatts. And you'd have to deploy a lot of storage in order to actually be exporting. So we think even with no constraints at all, that physical reality, it's unlikely that we'll export unless we're doing something, to your point earlier, about plug-in solar, which also, by the way, does not need to be small. And we can talk about that in a bit. But what we've found is, this is another sort of mind-blowing moment for me, is that when you look at the National Electric Code and UL certification and how outside of whatever jurisdiction that you're in, just what is safe physically to do, you can do hundreds of kilowatt hours in buildings because there will be multiple 200 to 400 amp panels. Each of those, there's the 120 rule, and you can push a lot more power into them than you think, not just like these little batteries. So we're keeping things small because of the current environment that we live in. But the physical sort of safe way to do it, I see paths to having, imagine in every panel in a commercial building, you have a stack of these batteries like a server rack.
Right.
And they're all plug-in based. You're not just doing one giant system on the roof, which does have totally different safety and weight considerations and all this stuff and needs permits, et cetera. But when you think about these metropolitan areas, you could imagine solar on every balcony, solar on the roof, storage on every panel, and they're all plugged in. And you're talking about megawatt scale deployments. And so from that perspective, I don't think it's small. But we're not doing that right now. And the bigger constraint is not necessarily the exporting, because the peak demand on these buildings can be quite large.
Right. So you're saying basically you don't need to export back into the grid to scale these systems up a lot.
For this commercial application that we're focused on, that's right. And I imagine, because obviously the original, you think back to Impulse, they were like, okay, let's plug a battery into a stove and now I don't need electrical work. Now we're looking at this whole balcony solar movement. David Energy is in this new category of commercial plug-in deployments. And this is also where you start bleeding into plug-in versus permissionless, is It may not be a 120 or 240 volt outlet or something, but the idea of deploying solar and storage, we don't understand all the form factors yet. And the reason I've been harping on this small thing is like you can do pretty large installations that are not exporting and are plug-in.
In a big customer, in a large size customer.
Yes. So big customers, plug-in can be a superior means of deploying storage than a traditional system from like the techno-economic, like physical layer and what is currently allowed under National Electric Code and the UL certifications.
So when you say big, you think like for an individual customer, you can reach the same sort of scale that they would get by having a full-on permitted rooftop solar installation and a full-on permitted large-scale battery. You think you can reach that same scale with plug-in Legos, basically.
You know, the solar one seems a little more unlikely. Like at some point, you should just do a proper install and
right.
make sure it's wind rated and interconnected and all this stuff, because solar is producing so much during the day. It's probably going to be exporting too. And the point of the plug-in rule is like, if you're only exporting a little, you don't need an interconnection agreement. But if you're exporting a lot, like you should probably have an interconnection agreement. I think there's a limit there. I do when I think of like floors on buildings and how many panels are currently available and like these quote pre-existing interconnection agreements. I think it's very possible you get to a bigger installation doing that, all regulatory questions aside, like physically that's better than a rooftop or ground mount storage system. So if not bigger than the traditional way, certainly quite big. And I think that's even true of the solar side. Like there's someone, Raya Power out there is doing really cool stuff where it's like a not quite balcony, it's like its own self-ballasted system that could be like a couple kW. And I could totally see that being on New York City roofs.
I find the subject slightly vexing because when I talk to like Coro, when I talk to the plug-in solar people, talk to you, everybody's like, a little backfeed into the grid is no big deal. Let's just permit this. And I know there are people out there crusading to sort of change state laws on this to allow this. But then, I hear from electricians, master electricians, and they're like, well, hold on now. There's all these risks from backfead, and I'm sure you've heard the whole litany of risks. And I just like, how are we, sort of electromechanically ignorant, onlookers to sort of assess this question? Like, who's got the right of that? How do you think about the safety of backfeeding?
Well, I'd say there's two components, and I would say I'm not an expert on this. I would definitely defer to the BrightSaver folks. That said, one real concern I've heard from utilities is that if there's a grid outage and there's a line worker out working, and because of backfeeding, a line is energized that they don't know or expect because from the utility's perspective, that line is down, that's a danger. I think that's quite manageable. For example, even in the batteries we deploy, if the grid goes down, they trip off. So there's ways you can do this with any sort of, the way you're actually configuring these systems. The other one would just be, I understand the utility desire to understand how much supply and capacity is being deployed on a given feeder, for example. So if you were to raise that limit from 1.2 kW up to 50 per home and everyone was doing it, like you could be pushing a lot of power onto a distribution feeder just in like normal operation. And I think that's a reasonable concern as well. And that sort of gets into like up to a certain amount of capacity deployed. Do we need interconnection per system, or could it be more of like an application where you're like, hey, just so you know, I'm doing this thing? I think we're just starting to ask those questions, honestly, or there are folks out there who know a lot more than I do. But those are like the two big ones as I understand sort of like legitimate safety concerns. There might be others, though.
I mean, this is like a bit of a crude heuristic, but they have run this experiment in Germany, and there were a lot of concerns up front, a lot of electricians, objecting to this, a lot of sort of apocalyptic predictions, but they've legalized a little bit of feed-in with their plug-in solar, and they've installed now just like gigawatts and gigawatts of these plug-in solar systems. And as far as I know, there's been basically no problem.
Yeah.
The fears have not come to pass in Germany, at least.
Yeah. And again, I think that comes down to like When I say allowed, I mean at the like physical electrical code, what are we actually doing to the grid? Safety is very important, and these systems are very safe. And that's why that has played out. And interestingly enough, the bridge between those two things, at least as I understand it, is the choice to say 1.2 kW is mostly so that hobbyists and consumers who are going to self-install these systems don't overload at the circuit level. So 1.2 kW or 1.9 kW even points at the 120 rule of like a 20 amp breaker, for example. Or I think 1.2 may be how much power you can push onto like a 15 amp circuit potentially. And so if you made the rule, 20 kilowatts, someone may just start like plugging tons and tons of solar into their home and actually overloading at the circuit level. So the bridge between how much can you export without an interconnection agreement actually does tie back to like circuit level physically, what's safe, what do we want to make allowed so that when customers are self-deploying and when products are being offered, they're being done so in a way that is safe naturally at the physical level.
And I'll just wave my hands at this too, just to say that I think in the future, these distribution level circuits are going to be much more smart, lots more sensors, lots more software governed. You know what I mean? Lots more ability to sort of see where power is and distribute it as you need it rather than relying on physical, circuit breakers and that type of thing. So I'm guessing it will get safer and you will be able to do more over time.
This is such a good point, and why I think, that having like real conversations between people in the industry and utility folks and regulators is so important. Because when you think back, a lot of the safety standards of the utility, and rightfully so, are very mechanical in nature.
Yes.
Like it's literally metal, like flipping.
Yeah.
It's like, and in talking actually at Dervos, I won't name names, with a utility exec, I was like, hey, if we could demonstrably prove that we were incapable of exporting, not through a mechanical switch, but through software in a way that was demonstrated, you believed that this was safe. He said, yes, that would not require an interconnection agreement because of the export limit, like when the grid is down and things like that, if it handled the safety concern. So I would just put it this way. I think as an industry, we need to ask the question, what is interconnection? Like we have all of these feeders are bidirectional physically. You could export safely physically under certain conditions the same amount as you're drawing in, right?
Right.
And so it's like, why do you need an interconnection to push out? I could put batteries behind the meter and discharge and take that whole home offline, and that doesn't need an interconnection, or does it? And there are different opinions around this, around the industry of like what does and does not require an interconnection at all.
Right. And it's all going to get smarter.
Yes.
And the pieces are all coming together. So right now, you are in New York City selling to small businesses, franchises, laundromats, the like. Who is next? Like, what is the potential customer base here? What other customer classes or types are you going to expand to as time goes on? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who changed majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. Who is next? Like, what is the potential customer base here? What other customer classes or types are you going to expand to as time goes on? And where is this possible? Do you require retail competition, right? At least. So, like, what is the potential kind of customer base and geography base here?
So we haven't gone too deep on other geos, but just based on what we know, we can expand across PJM and New England for the most part.
Mm-hmm. They need it.
Yes, I agree. You can think of really any storefront or even like direct metered commercial tenant space, like an office potentially, like maybe a legal office or something like that.
What about multifamily? I don't know, if I just have a condo, like, can I do some version of this? I mean, do I even have enough power? Am I even using enough power? Have you thought of it at all about multifamily, or is that not a potential?
Yes, we have. We definitely aspire to launch a product, like a retail energy product that would cater to the type of people who are going out and will be buying and self-installing solar and batteries because of all the awesome work that BrightSaver is doing. We're just starting in this lane of self-deploying for now. But once solar and batteries are getting connected, there's ways to optimize them where without, a counterparty with like David Energy, aggregating them up, offering them into grid services, doing arbitrage, all that stuff, your average multifamily renter is not going to be doing. So we don't have any near-term plans to do that, but we certainly aspire to over time. And I would say we definitely have our hands full now on the storefront perspective. I mean, we've been in cafes, restaurants, gyms for a while, but we're starting to get like laundromats and salons and grocery stores. And you can think of that whole commercial space, commercial tenants across all the major states in PJM, New England, and New York as areas that we want to expand into in the coming years, sort of standalone. And then separately, there's new products like multifamily renters.
Okay, you're installing all these batteries, and you're the provider for all these. You're the retail provider for all these businesses. Are you doing any aggregation into VPPs, or is that part of the play? Aggregating to provide grid services, all the VPP stuff. Are you into that?
Yeah. So we aggregate our customers and dispatch them, as an aggregation, basically.
Interesting. I'm curious, how big of a piece of the revenue is that?
The VPP side?
Yeah.
I would say it's a meaningful amount. In New York, you can drive a lot of value just through peak shaving on the delivery side. That's all value that goes to the customer. So actually, like, all of our revenue is the VPP side. So we dispatch it as one thing. So against our demand obligation with the New York ISO and at the, say, a grid services program level, all of that we think of as an aggregation. And that is where all of our value comes from. And, it expands over time again. As you start layering in things like solar, it's kind of like the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts.
Right. I heard you were talking with Shale Khan on his pod, and you were, one of the hot subjects these days, which I've covered on the pod many times, everybody's talking about, is these data centers desperately need capacity. The fastest way to get capacity is DERs, in my opinion. Do you think that these, I know you're going to yell at me for saying small, but like, like relative to data center needs, any one of these installations is tiny. Are you going to be able to aggregate to a meaningful scale that it would matter to a data center? Like, you think you're going to get big enough to play in that pool?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the white paper that you discussed with Cora is great, of like, looking at Germany, like how much of this stuff is going to get deployed in the coming years. And I think that's because we're only just beginning to understand that that's like one form factor of this stuff. And so if, again, and I'm talking theoretically about these like larger scale plug-in installations, imagine something like that would be allowed under the varying regulatory environments that that could lead to far greater numbers of this stuff than we could imagine currently. But like what I would say, and again, I've not done the analysis or made like a real projection here, but I think in terms of gigawatts and tens of gigawatts in the near term. And I don't see anything stopping us and other players in the market from doing that. Let me say it again, in contrast to the current way we're deploying DERs, there's too much friction for the current permitted, interconnected way to scale to something meaningful enough in my mind. Plug-in at least offers a path. So imagine if every time you bought an iPhone or went and bought a laptop or something, you needed like a permit and an interconnection, like the in an inspection. Like the internet never would have scaled, right? Like in order for this thing to really happen, people need to be able to go out and buy and deploy these things without as much friction as there is today. And so when I just like look at that property and knowing that we're actually probably quite naive right now and not understanding all the ways in which this stuff is going to express itself, I think plug-in, at least on a sort of like first principles level, offer the DERS industry the promise that got me excited about DERs 10 years ago. And I don't think we've actually, that promise has been able to deliver until now. Like I really do see this as like a dawn of just a totally different way of deploying that I'm incredibly excited about. So that's like the worst way to answer this. I know, I'm sorry, but like...
Let me nail you down on one thing.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Just take New York State. Like, do you think that plug-in capacity cumulatively will exceed traditional DER capacity? And if so, when? I know this is a level of arbitrariness to this. So like approximately how you're thinking about this.
I think, yeah, definitely for storage. When I look at the whole commercial landscape, plug-in batteries just seem to make more sense to me. And like multifamily buildings, I don't know the extent to which balcony solar versus like a traditional system, how we're still in the early innings of exploring that. But I would say 100% yes for storage.
Interesting. And here's kind of another slightly vague question, but do you ever worry that kind of the reason this is all going off so smoothly is that it's not yet reached a scale where like people are noticing and that if you do start to get to really substantial scale that the US is sort of, you know, red tape prone regulators and legislators are going to start biting at your ankles and trying to get in and regulate this more and trying to get in. And I wonder almost like, are you trying to sort of race to a certain scale before you draw the eye of Sauron, as it were? Is that kind of how you think about it?
Yes and no. I mean, like, sorry, you can't pin me down. I'm sorry, David. But in the long arc of things, I trust that if our system is working, like, this stuff makes sense. It is safe. It is cheaper to deploy. It's good in so many ways. There are real safety questions and real like aspects of deployment that are unanswered, but certainly answerable and that we will answer over time. It's not like there shouldn't be regulations. It's like we should create the right frameworks around this like radically new technology, and that like I trust we will grind through the mechanics of that over time.
I mean, you are creating constituents, right? I mean, you are... Like every one of these little businesses who are getting cheaper power now are, in some sense, a constituent for this.
Yes, and it's safe to do. So, like, what are we going to say? Like, no, they shouldn't get access to this, like, new technology, you know? Which, by the way, would be a very politically challenging position to hold, I think. Yeah. Clean, cheap energy for renters and tenants, like that
yeah,
seems like anyone on either side of the aisle will support.
We do lots of dumb stuff, though, don't?
Yes. The short answer is like, certainly with anything new, there will be jurisdictions or certain regulators or certain utility members that don't like this, you know, and some of their concerns are even going to be valid, you know, but actually the best way to have those conversations is to show that it can scale and that it's something that must be contended with, because people are going to go out and do this. It's good to do. And we should catch the ball as a system, as a society, not try and close Pandora's box, which I don't think is going to happen. It's not it's like that's the myth, right? It's like it can't happen. It's open. So here we are. You know, we got to deal with it now.
Well, speaking of that, we've been talking about your business and David Energy. Talk a little bit about like who else is in this plug-in. I mean, it's nascent. It's early, as you say, early days in this. But like, who are the other players out there? What are they doing?
Yeah, so Impulse Labs has the battery embedded stove so that you don't need to upgrade your standard 120 volt outlet, which I think is awesome. Copper.
Yeah, I interviewed them 2 years or 3 years ago. I was hyped about those battery embedded stoves early on.
Yeah, and so that's another one. EcoFlow is currently the battery that we're using, which are making some really incredible products in this category. Pila is another newer startup. Bright Saver, who Every Electric is here in New York City, who I mentioned.
I just saw someone trying to raise funds on Kickstarter for something they're pitching as a fridge battery. Like it's literally a battery you put next to your refrigerator to ensure that if the power goes out, your refrigerator stays on. And my first thought was like, well, how long until refrigerator manufacturers just integrate that? Just put the battery in the fridge.
Yeah, I think the, Impulse and Copper may be at the front end again of like a whole wave of battery embedded products like the heat pump or the fridge. And I don't know that company in particular, but Pila, a big part of their value prop up front is actually resilience for something like a fridge.
Right. Speaking of the legality, like I've seen like probably a half dozen products like this just floating by on Kickstarter, just little batteries for various things. There, you can sort of feel people groping around just the right way to market them, like just the right way to present them to customers. Like, is it backup? Is it cheaper power? Is it keeping your fridge on? It's so interesting to watch this sort of take shape.
I'll even admit that we don't fully understand that yet. Like, yes, people love savings, but one thing I was going to mention before that has really sort of warmed my DERS loving heart is how much just the average customer thinks batteries are cool. Like if you went to a customer, and a lot of retailers have done this and said, I'm going to save you 5% on your power bill, you're going to get a lot of skepticism. But you say, and I'm going to do it with a battery, they immediately are like, oh, that makes sense. And that's cool. And I want it.
Interesting. So you're not running into like, battery fires and leaching chemicals into this, all this BS sort of misinformation about batteries is flying around these days. You're not running into any of that?
No. And I think people are smarter than that. Like how many hours have they walked around with a phone in their pocket and a laptop and not had it explode on them?
People are pretty familiar with batteries.
It's just like all of these things are like myths from a prior era. And we literally scoured the internet trying to find, there are people out there who literally try to start fires with these batteries and cannot. They're using power drills, they're using like water, all sorts of crazy setups, and like they can't do it. So obviously there's still like safety concerns. And again, we care a lot about safety, but like I think we're in this era, especially with LFP, where we know that they're safe. And I think the average person does too.
Yeah. And I really think also you can't understate how much the spread of electric vehicles have just kind of like got people thinking about batteries, basically, like just sort of foregrounded batteries in general. Okay, as I said, the reason you can offer customers cheaper power is that you're doing a little arbitrage. So I wonder if in some future scenario, say in PJM, they install a crapload of utility scale battery installations, or they do a ton of what Minnesota's doing, which is putting like these sort of mid-scale batteries on commercial and industrial land. It's just like the grid in general gets a lot more batteries on it. That is, perforce, that's going to flatten things out and reduce the amount of arbitrage available, which will diminish the appeal of your current economic pitch, will it not? Is that something that you worry about at all? I mean, would love to have that problem, but like, is that something you think about?
It's not actually, for two reasons. One is our whole purpose for vertically integrating across supply demand is the same as in any market environment or any sort of like commodity player, is that if we are self-supplying the consumption of our customers, we are not exposed to price. we can earn stable margins in many different market environments. And so if prices are low, we're still just buying from our own solar and storage. If they're high, there may be some upside there. But so our goal on running 100% on clean energy is also just like, it's also a statement of what is viable about the business. Is if you look at NRG and Vistra, they own all the gen, and that gives them their market power, right? The second reason I'll say that is that what I love about distributed energy is that because of that co-location element that we talked about, distributed outcompetes utility scale. So there's a remarkable property of DERs that I think originally Derpilled me 10 years ago, which is it's the same cost to build on a small scale as on a large scale. That's actually like increasingly becoming true with plug-in because you don't need thermodynamic efficiencies of scale. So if I want to go build a coal plant, I should go build like a big gigawatt.
Right. Same with nuclear.
The same with nuclear. If I'm deploying utility scale solar, it's actually all the same components. There's like some efficiencies, but like not as much as you'd think. The panels may even be similarly sized as like a rooftop install, And so when you're manufacturing these things off a line, that's where your efficiencies of scale come from. What that means is if I place a battery or solar on the grid, the closer I place it to demand, the less I need to rely on wires and the more there's an economic benefit of doing so. And so if the cost is equivalent, roughly, and there's a greater benefit from being connected to demand, it's going to connect to demand. You also get like resilience benefit and stuff like that. And so I'll just throw out this one stat that I always come back to. And it's something like in Australia, utility scale solar is like $1,100 a kilowatt and rooftop is $1,200. In California, utility scale is like $1,200 a kilowatt and rooftop is $4,200. So the difference is soft costs. It's not the physical properties of this stuff. And so I always just come back to that what that means is, if anything, the grid edge stuff, and this is also why I'm going to continue harping on small, when you place that next to demand, I'd worry about the wholesale stuff being outcompeted. And because their only value is wholesale, they don't have a T&D benefit. They lose all their revenue potential. I think at the end of the day, when you think about, so say on the smallness point is like every meter, every home building should have some amount of solar and storage.
Amen.
Because that's the most economic place to put it, So like that will sum up to a lot over time.
You're not in the manufacturing, you're not designing your own batteries. I presume you're probably not going to get into that. So in some sense, you're dependent on the form factor of batteries that other people are producing. Is there any sort of like form factor you'd like to see that you're not seeing now? Like, are there like literally just like kind of the shape and size of these small batteries that you're Legoing into installations? Is there a form factor you would like some manufacturer to get into?
100%. I mean, we are already in conversation with a variety of suppliers about that form factor. And I think, the rule in these partnerships, which is that they have their competencies, which is building this stuff. We have ours, which is doing all the commodity and energy market stuff. And if we're buying in sufficient volumes, that we have seen suppliers be very open to creating a form factor, not just for us, but that they think if we're deploying them in a given way that, someone else will come along and want to do it. So there'll be some other customer for them.
But like what? What form factor? Like what do you like? Taller, skinnier, lighter? Like what would you like to see?
I would say more stackable, not just like you've seen how they stand up, right? The batteries we're currently using. I think like a higher energy to power ratio, so you don't need so many of them. We haven't really gotten into the like other voltages stuff, but that is something we may want to do, like 240 or 208 or something. But right now, it just means we're using a few plugs if we want to do a bigger install. And so there's ways to consolidate the number of plugs you need and also how many inverters that means you need. And so that like you can get much more efficient over time.
And you're using LFP, less fire prone, slightly less energy dense, but safer. Is supposed to be the kind of trade-off with lithium ion. Is there a chemistry that would help? Do you think about that at all? Are there any other sort of chemistries on the horizon that you think would be good for these sort of applications? Or is LFP just fine?
I think it's great. I've been thinking a lot about like Spectrum boxes. It's like you don't think about your Spectrum box as this like expensive CapEx or something. There may be like $100 charge if you don't return it or something. I don't think batteries ever get there.
This is your cable box, right?
Cable, that's right. And so I think plug-in batteries will approach something closer to that than we can imagine right now, just on the like lithium ion and lithium iron phosphate cost curve, where it's like, why would I not have batteries plugged in at the grid edge and my provider help facilitate that for me?
Well, if they're embedded in every appliance, like you're going to be doing it whether you want to or even know you're doing it at all.
That's right.
Okay, final question, real final question. Like if I'm a state legislator listening to all this, I'm intrigued, I'm excited. I mean, God knows New York in particular, New York City, New York in particular has a lot of congestion problems, a lot of like cost problems with deploying their clean energy. They're kind of rolling back their laws now and their regulations. So it's like, if I'm a state legislator hearing this, like, do you need or want any particular regulatory or legislative help? Or do you just want them to leave you alone while you cook?
Yeah.
What I mean? Like, is there anything that would be helpful?
Look, I think the work Brightsaver is doing is incredible, and those laws are incredibly important for the particular class of deployments that, for the multifamily renter, for example. Again, I think in this plugin conversation, what we're doing, our application is not really being contemplated necessarily from like a regulatory standpoint. So I think for our case, it leans closer to let us cook because we have the National Electric Code and UL certification, and these things are incredibly safe. There are these interesting questions around like interconnection and how much should be exported, but I think what Brightsaver is doing is like all you need to do there, for now at least, until we understand more. I would more just speak directly to them and say, the customers that now have DERs available to them, like multifamily renters and small businesses, are not happy about rising electric prices. And these are tools that they now have access to that we should help them get access to however we can, especially if you're a clean energy advocate. And, the two things that everyone has always used is one is like, only rich people buy these, which honestly is true to a lot of degree, like they're credit-worthy off-takers. And two, you need incentives like the ITC or what have you. But if you just look at it from like we're getting access to people who are feeling the pain and who need more affordable solutions, and you don't really need any complicated incentives or regulatory regimes to do that, it's kind of a no-brainer to support it however we can. But again, in our application, I don't think there is that much support that we actually need.
Let you cook.
Yeah, we'll take it.
Super interesting, James. Thank you so much for coming on. This is really like super intriguing stuff. I can't wait to see where all this goes. So thanks for coming on and walking us through it.
Thanks so much, David. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.